So, earlier this week we discussed how Pokemon Legends ZA leaked all over the internet, and I have another leak for that game to tell you about today, but ZA wasn't alone in being exposed. That's right, Game Freak has had a heck of a week with the proclaimed Terra Leak, as some like to call it, or, for the nice double entendre, some of us prefer the term FreakLeak. Heh, 'cause if you know, you know. We actually also got some insight into Gen 10. Now, this is crazy because we're all extremely focused on Legends ZA at the moment, so Generation 10 at this point feels like an afterthought to most of us. However, when life gives you applins, you make... well, never mind. I've compiled all the info you need to know about Generation 10 here in one place, and as I mentioned earlier, there's actually one more leak for Pokemon Legends ZA that we should talk about beforehand. Now, I didn't get to talk about this in the last video because this information literally just hit yesterday. This ounce of information was actually dripped to us by Riddler Koo, who is a known insider to Game Freak's development. Koo didn't bother riddling this one, as it's a fairly non-spoilery bit of information, but apparently, Pokemon Legends ZA will not have an art style similar to Legends Arceus, rather, one similar to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Let's take a moment to dissect this. This could mean one of two things. One is that Koo is referring to the style of the character models and such in Scarlet and Violet, where characters are generally more slim and lanky by proportion, almost like something out of a Tim Burton film, but not quite that extreme. Compare that to Legends Arceus, where proportions are more anime-inspired, the characters are more filled out. This could be the case of what Riddler Koo was talking about, as the trailer for Legends ZA does show some character models, and they certainly do maintain that more lanky aesthetic from SV. However, I'd actually argue these are more of a mix of the art styles, and even go so far as to say that if these are the proportions the characters will have in Legends ZA, this might be the most mature take on character designs in Pokemon history. This is the closest we've ever seen Pokemon NPCs look to real-life human proportions, and I'm all here for it. Sadly, the more likely explanation of what Koo was referring to when it comes to art style is cell shading versus exposed art styles. I think most of us agree the cell shading just plain looks and works better for Pokemon on so many levels, so this might be a bit disappointing to some people. I've even done polls on this, and cell-shaded Pokemon art style has won by an overwhelming majority. It's great because, well, to put it mildly, Game Freak isn't known for graphical prowess. Cell shading does a lot of work in hiding flaws in textures and even jaggies in assets. Not only that, but the Nintendo Switch, while fairly decent at graphics, isn't the best around, and most developers acknowledge that, especially for these larger games, and stick with cell shading just by proxy of knowing games on the system just straight up look better when cell shaded. I find it kind of baffling if Game Freak really does stick to an exposed art style. When looking at Scarlet and Violet, which uses the exposed assets with no cell shading, some things do look very good, namely the Pokemon models. We're being able to see the new models in raw glory, as well as those super high quality textures that were added as of Legends Arceus, now without gloss to cover them, looks phenomenal, and definitely adds some eye candy. Character models were also fairly detailed, and their facial expressions especially are even better than in Legends Arceus. However, overall, the game very much suffers visually from being exposed. Game Freak's use of repeated low-res textures and jagged assets really bog down the presentation quite substantially, and I can't help but think about how we know it would all look a million times better with a simple coat of cell shading. Now, keep in mind, as far as Legends ZA goes, the exposed art style could also be subject to change, since the game is still in development, and as far as we know, cell shading does come later in the development cycle. Perhaps Koo is only speaking on what he's seen, though it's just as likely he actually has the insider info on the art style Game Freak decided on pre-development. But time will tell, and I digress. We're here mainly to discuss Gen 10. So if you guys have any more thoughts on this matter, please feel free to write them down in the comments so we can continue the discussion there. Now, Generation 10 of Pokemon has been found to be codenamed Gaia. Keep that name in mind, as it's going to be very important to a big revelation later. Meanwhile, we also got the codename for Nintendo Switch 2, and it's codenamed Ounce. What this codename means, I actually have no idea, aside from maybe its draw being that it's super lightweight for how much processing power it possesses, and that would be especially great if it really is a Switch 2 proper, because it would be handheld. Maybe you guys have some other thoughts, so let me know down in the comments, but the reason we found out the codename for Switch 2 is because, apparently, unlike Legend ZA, Generation 10 really is being developed primarily for the Ounce, aka Switch 2. The best thing about that is Gen 10 will have to look better than anything we've seen in the series thus far. Game Freak has gotten a lot better at developing on an HD console, and to develop on a console that presumably has better graphical capabilities can only mean a net positive, especially in the performance department. It's also worth noting that Game Freak is testing a Switch 1 version of Gaia, but whether or not that comes to fruition remains to be seen. We might actually see Legend ZA be the new dual system release, since everything at Game Freak got rightfully delayed a year. Generation 10 will also, as expected, host 2 versions. Currently, those 2 versions are codenamed K and N. Now, before you go speculating in English, from the way this was reported, it's assumed these letters are representative of Japanese words, not English ones, even though they're using Romanji. I have done a bit of research into what these words could stand for, but so far, everything I've guessed hasn't had an opposite word that starts with the opposite letter. The closest I got was with light and dark, as well as null and infinite, with the latter being more promising as there are a lot of words that could represent the opposite of null in both English and Japanese, and maybe one out there starts with a K. But, as always, comment your predictions down below and we'll talk about it. Finally, let's discuss the region that Generation 10 will take place in. We've gotten confirmation from both the FreakLeak and also Riddler Koo on what the region will be like. Koo gave a riddle of too much water, and the FreakLeak told us about an archipelago of islands that we'll be exploring. Now, on their own, this does give quite a few options, but when we look at the codename for Generation 10, I think the answer seems extremely clear. Generation 10 is codenamed Gaia, and Gaia is the Greek goddess of Earth and mother to all life. Greece does indeed consist heavily of collective islands. Therefore, I think it's fairly safe to assume Generation 10 will take place in a fictional version of Greece. Not only that, but having so much water, as well as Pokemon's steadfast direction of a more open-world experience, this makes it extra exciting to think about the different ways we might be able to traverse the region, namely how we're going to traverse over the water, and perhaps under it as well. We've all been wanting diving to come back, and if Legend ZA ends up not being the game for that, then I have very little doubt that Generation 10 will be the title that we finally see a return of a diving mechanic. Now, I will be covering more of these leaks as they come, but in the meantime, let me know what has you most excited, or even just your general thoughts, down below in the comments section, and afterwards, check out more of my videos, such as the Smash Bros. Cinematic Universe, which just released its 7th episode last Sunday, and more new episodes are coming every Sunday, including this one, for the next few weeks. So, get excited for that, and I've been JotoJohnny, and I will catch you all there.